And now, here's the weather and feature anchor of the Today Show and co-host of the third hour of Today, Al Roker.
Climate change is as urgent as ever. We're seeing warmer temperatures, more hurricanes, wildfires, and flooding. Scientists and environmentalists have been sounding alarms for many years. Now, is the changing climate finally palpable enough for our general population and climate change deniers to take it more seriously? Can we slow global warming down before it's too late? Well, joining us now is the administrator of the EPA, Michael S. Regan. Michael, good to see you.
It's good to see you as well.
And before we start, just a technical note here. We're in these chairs that if you move, they make the sound of methane escaping. So we just want people to know it's not us. All right, so, but thanks so much for being here. We really appreciate it. And just last week, UN General Assembly met. Secretary General Antonio Guterres said, "We are on the verge of the abyss and we cannot afford to step in the wrong direction." So, to your mind, what were the biggest takeaways on climate change policy coming out of the General Assembly?
You know, I think the biggest change is really nothing that we haven't been listening to for quite some time. I think there's a bigger commitment on the international stage, with America being one of these countries that's taking it very serious. The president had it right. This is a code red climate moment. And I think on that UN stage, you saw a number of countries banding together, really digesting and embracing the science and committing, putting serious commitments on the table to combat climate change.
But how do we make sure countries, including our own, follow up on those commitments?
You know, I think with the UN coming together and putting these commitments in place, that's the first step. I think all of the countries have to put regulations, policies, tax incentives, investments in place. That's what we need to see happening globally, and that's what you're seeing with President Biden's Build Back Better agenda. It's really not just a slogan. It's a shot in the arm in terms of how we can invest in this country, combat climate change, create millions of jobs, but make this country globally competitive.
Speaking globally, you know, we got the opening of COP26, the UN Climate Change Conference in Glasgow. It's just a month away. Do you see building on what came out of the UN General Assembly happening at COP26?
Absolutely. I think what you'll see are serious commitments from countries all around the globe, including the United States, making significant declarations on what we're committed to do to combat climate change, from regulations and policies and commitments, all the way to real significant investments in infrastructure, environmental justice and equity, and the assurance that we are looking at economic incentives to make this country competitive, but also to combat it on the global stage.
And you talk about the global stage, you know, given the previous 4 years, there had been a pullback from our commitments to climate change. How do you silence those critics who say, well, you know, that happened. How do we know that that's not going to happen again?
You know, what's different about this go around are the significant investments that we're seeing at the national level, not just from the government, but we're seeing our private sector really put the money where their mouth is. We're seeing asset managers and others really advocating for the markets driving in this direction. We see advanced technologies that are coming online that can't be refuted. So what's happening is a rowing in the same direction from multiple industries across multiple sectors, as well as the government. You're seeing a holistic approach that's not just being driven by government and regulations, but by markets, technologies, and new business models.
I was going to ask, you know, you have governments who have to put in policy, put in regulation, but you also have to have buy-in from the private sector. Does the private sector now, from what you've seen, not only want to do good, but realize that really does affect their bottom line?
Absolutely. It really is about the bottom line. It's also about their ability to recruit and retain a new workforce. I mean, the reality is sustainability, climate change, climate reducing pollutants. This is all part of the common vernacular, especially of our youth. And so companies are evolving, looking at their bottom lines, but looking at how they can be relevant and be competitive moving forward.
Because now consumers are actually holding them responsible for being good corporate citizens of the planet.
Absolutely. The market is really the rallying cry. And I think what the president is really grabbed onto, not only is the market the rallying cry, but when I travel the country, overwhelmingly, we see support for the types of investments that he's advocating for to protect our planet, to invest in our infrastructure, but just as important, to create jobs. There are millions of jobs associated with this new clean energy economy, and I think people are on board.
When you talk about that, there are going to be communities and areas where older technologies, older jobs that are based more on carbon-based economies, those jobs are going to be going away. How do you go into those communities and say, we're going to transition to these new cleaner energy jobs and make sure that folks can take part in that new economy?
You know, some of that requires education and retraining, but the good news is a lot of these skills are transferable to the new clean economy. Many of the folks that have the skill sets in carpentry, electricians, general contractors, accountants, engineers, these are all transferable disciplines and skills. So we anticipate that there will be an opportunity for lots of people to participate in what we're seeing as the new future. In the meanwhile, there will be certain trades and certain communities that we will have to help transition. But the plan is to look at how we can use this moment as a rising tide for all communities and not leave anyone behind.
This is also a time where, at the EPA, environmental justice and trying to correct some inequalities when it comes to communities of color who have been obviously more impacted by air pollution, a lack of water quality. That is now a priority.
It is. It should have been a priority long before now, but the president pledged that racial justice and environmental justice will be center to this administration. EPA has made that a priority, and to your point, we have seen the disproportionate impact of pollution on many of our communities of color and our tribal communities, and now climate change is just compounding that, it's exacerbating that. So we have an obligation to provide equal protection from pollution to all communities, and this is the moment.
And air quality is one of those big drivers of that inequality. At the EPA, what are you folks doing to try to correct those problems?
You know, from the very beginning, I've requested that all of my staff look at their program implementation through the lens of environmental justice and equity. What that means is every policy, every regulation, every contract, all procurement will be done through the lens of environmental justice. We're also ramping up our enforcement. There are laws on the books that should protect all communities. We have to do a better job of enforcing those laws. There's no secret here that many communities, many of our vulnerable communities, are seeing disproportionate impacts of pollution, which exacerbates asthma. We're seeing higher incidences of lung disease and heart disease. This is because of exposure. It's our obligation to think through how we protect our most vulnerable.
Is there any one policy that comes to mind that's going to help address that in the short term?
You know, it's not one policy. It's a whole of government approach. And at EPA, what we're doing is we're looking across all of our offices, from outreach and education to our water and our air offices and our land management offices. We've seen water pollution that disproportionately impacts our vulnerable communities, air pollution, brownfields and Superfund sites that have been left abandoned in our communities, where we have an opportunity to clean up that legacy pollution, that old abandoned gas station, and really turn that part of the community into a thriving economic development opportunity. So it's an all of the above approach, and it's going to take that. 2021
has been a year of weather extremes. Seems like, much like for folks in the pandemic, when we were looking for 2021 to be a reset from 2020, well, it's been the same way weather-wise, you know, just all these extremes, fires, floods, hurricanes. There are those who look at this, and we know climate is something that you look at over the long term, but have you looked at this and almost scratch your head. Could we be at a tipping point that we've seen a number of these events now happening over a short span of time, and that could we be looking at a tipping point at this juncture?
We are looking at a tipping point. We're close to the edge. But what I find as I travel the country, people, some are listening to the scientists, some are listening to the meteorologists like yourself who have been talking about this issue for a long period of time. Some are listening to our national security advisors. But most are looking at what they're seeing and what they're feeling.
In their own communities.
In their own communities. Wildfires ravaging the West, droughts, floods in the middle of the country, storms like Hurricane Ida ravaging the Gulf Coast, landing in New York and New Jersey. This is not a far-fetched idea anymore. This isn't something that you have to have a science degree to understand. People are looking outside of their windows and seeing what's happening right in front of their very eyes. And so I think that there is much more of an awareness now, which is going to make it easier for us to connect with our communities with bold solutions. We have to ensure that the conversations that are happening all across the country permeate the gridlock that we're seeing in Washington, D.C.
I was just going to say, it seems to me, anecdotally, when I've traveled covering these stories, that the average American citizen knows this is happening. They see this is happening. It affects them. It affects their neighbors. That they are at a point of acceptance of this in far greater numbers than their elected officials. Do you think that they need to help their elected officials come along board?
They're absolutely going to have to apply pressure to those who represent them so that those who represent them are actually representing their best interests. We know we have an aging infrastructure. We know that we need to repair our water infrastructure just to get the basics around good quality drinking water. Some of that is because the infrastructure is aging. Some of that is because it's been pounded by extreme weather. And so people are really seeing it at the very basic level. And I think that they will have to apply more pressure to their elected officials so that we can get the investments that we need. Again, this is about an opportunity to put regular people to work repairing a failing infrastructure, making it more resilient to climate change while earning a good paycheck. This is common sense, and these are the types of investments we need to see all across the country.
When you look at the investments we need to make, and there are, we're just one country, granted a large part of that issue, but what about the bigger countries having to help the smaller developing countries that are probably having greater issues in a sense proportionately as far as creating cleaner energy, better conditions, and those sort of things? Because now we've got to take care of ourselves, but we have to take care of or help along these other countries.
We do, and I think the president's message to the UN was we're all in this together. And I think there was a commitment there by the president that the developed nations need to invest more in some of the undeveloped countries because they're bearing the biggest brunt around climate change. But this is an opportunity for America to lead, which is what the president's doing. This really is about leadership. Many of the solutions that we have at our fingertips that we need to see play out will play out if Congress approves the resources that we need to get that shot in the arm. And so this is a significant opportunity for America to continue to lead, step out on that international stage, and pull the rest of the world along with us.
As you look at what's on your desk, as you move through 2021 and look ahead towards 2022, what do you have coming up that you're really excited about?
I'm excited about our climate change agenda. Just last week, we announced a rule that phases down hydrofluorocarbons, many times more potent than carbon dioxide. We're going to reduce HFCs by 85% over the next 15 years. We proposed a rule to look at tailpipe emissions, which will usher our auto industry closer to, electric vehicles. We're going to propose a rule in the coming weeks that looks at reducing methane from our oil and gas sector. And we're going to round that out by looking at reducing pollution from our power plants. All of these, in a cumulative fashion, will put us on the right trajectory to be successful in reducing these climate pollutants. But I'm really excited about doing that along with our traditional mission of protecting people from air quality pollutants as well as water quality pollutants, and doing it through the lens of environmental justice and equity. This is an opportunity right now for EPA to use this as a rising tide for all communities, and the moment is now.
You know, we were just out, my producer and I, we were just out in California, and they had this mobile van that was registered, that would measure, you know, any kind of pollutants that were coming off of us personally or out of homes. That while, you know, we know that they're the usual suspects of auto emissions, you know, aircraft emissions, things like that, but that the regular products we use in our home, whether it's deodorants, hair shampoos, well, I don't use shampoo that much, but, you know, all those things that give off fragrances are an issue, and that California is working to try to, with manufacturers, to bring those, use more plant-based systems, to bring about a lessening of those air pollutants that we have in our homes that we don't even think about. Is that something that's on the docket for the EPA on a national level?
You know, I think we're focused on the biggest emitters of pollution. I think we all have some personal responsibility to reduce our carbon footprint, and we're seeing many companies develop products, as you've described, that reduces that pollution through the supply chain. But right now, the EPA is focused on the biggest polluters, the HFCs, the methane, the carbon from the coal plants. These are the opportune targets for us to really channel our energy, put the right rules of engagement in place so that we get meaningful reductions if we're going to meet our climate goals.
You know, you talk about the president's toolbox, things that he can do outside of Congress to affect these changes. But you know, as we've seen, unless these are kind of baked into our laws, they can be rolled back with the stroke of a pen. How do we make it that these are more baked into our legal DNA to protect the environment?
Well, the good news is we've seen over the past couple of administrations efforts to move forward and move back. The courts have weighed in. We have a much better competitive advantage right now to think about how we move forward with durable rules. So there have been some things that have been tried that have been less successful. We've also seen some things that have been very successful. It's our turn now to apply those lessons of the past to create a durable solution moving forward. But the trick this time is to marry these regulatory objectives with the power of the markets and the evolution of technology. Coupled together, it will create a momentum that will not be easily reversed.
What do you say to folks who say, this is so big, I feel helpless? What hope do you give them?
You know, within this crisis, there are significant opportunities. I mean, this is not a problem that's too big for this country or the world. We just have to roll up our sleeves and get to work. So what I would say in an optimistic fashion is if we can all row in the same direction, here's a significant opportunity to reduce pollution, make the quality of life better for everyone, and have good paying jobs associated with this transition. This is really an opportunity.
You know, you've got a young son. I've got teenagers and 20-somethings. And we've seen in this last year this youth movement rise up again. I mean, it seems every generation has this drive to affect change. And it seems that this environmental change is really being driven right now by young people. How is that impacting your policy?
Oh, significantly. As we know, when we look back at history, most big social movements are led by young people, which is why I've opened my doors and have been in communication with lots of young people who are tired of the gridlock and the excuses. They know that they will inherit this planet, which is why the president's Build Back Better agenda is much more than a slogan. It's a real shot in the arm to make the investments we need to deliver the type of protection to take care of the planet the way we need for our young people.
You speak about young people. There was a new study just out of journal Science. Climate change is going to bring 3 times as many climate disasters to today's 6-year-olds as opposed to their grandparents who were, say, born in 1960. Twice as many wildfires, almost twice as many tropical cyclones, 3.5 times more river floods. You know, it would seem that we are running out of time. How quickly do we need to act from a governmental standpoint, not just for us, but globally, before we can, if not reverse this, certainly slow it down?
We need to act now. I think we all have a major sense of urgency, which is why the president has this whole of government approach. I mean, we truly need to act right now. We need the investments that the president's asking for in climate mitigation to curtail the pollution we're seeing. Some of these things that you've laid out, we're going to be living with for the foreseeable future. So we need to invest in our current infrastructure so that it can be more resilient as well.
Do we have to wrap our heads around the idea that our way of life is changing, and that we can do what we need to do, but a lot of this is going to be about adaptation?
Absolutely. We do have to adapt to a changing environment. I think that is probably not going to be as difficult as we might think. I mean, to be honest, there are advanced technologies and ways to make life more efficient and simple that we're already evolving and adapting to. But yes, some of the changing weather patterns, looking at the different temperatures in different parts of the country, less water availability. Humanity is resilient by nature. These adaptive practices that we can put in place can be done in a way where it actually minimalizes the impact that we're seeing on a daily basis. And we talk about our children. As we think about the younger generation moving forward, many of these changes that we're having to make, they're unaware of. So this will be part of the new norm for them.
In wrapping this up, how are you optimistic that we can, if not stop these changes, that we can slow them down enough so that we buy ourselves more time as we catch up technically?
I'm very optimistic. I think the science and the data proves that if we act now with a sense of urgency, that we can slow global warming down and that we can adapt to what we're considering to be a new normal. We can adapt to this. We can thrive in this. It's just that we need to act now.
Well, Michael Regan, I know that you've got a lot on your plate going on right now, and I think part of the problem is I think people are almost exhausted because there's a certain amount of pessimism about this, and it's good to hear that there is some optimism. So we really appreciate you taking the time and talking with us about this.
Well, thank you.
All right, always good to see you. And if you noticed, we didn't hear that much from the chairs, so that worked out pretty nicely. Good to see you, sir.
Good to see you.
Thank you.